What if I were to suggest that you play a key role in the awakening world? And that you are watching this because you have heard the call. We can start right now by opening our hearts and minds. Welcome to the awakening world.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us for a very special edition of The Awakening World. And I want to welcome those of you who are in our Zoom room who decided to join us. Please let us know where you are geographically. That's always interesting. And I also want to acknowledge we've got a lot of people watching on our Facebook groups and pages. I see 53 people on Unify, and we're going to be going out over 100 different pages on Facebook through the Sign Network. Thank you, John and Summer Raymer, for helping to promote our shows and get us out to the world. For those of you who are not familiar with the Awakening World, this is an ongoing series that takes place every weekend, Friday night, Saturday night, and Sunday morning, where we take a topic and we explore it in depth. And we bring in presenters, we ask questions. We're here to learn, we're here to grow, we're here to evolve. So welcome. If any of you have questions, thoughts, comments, please put them into the chat box. I'll be monitoring the chat boxes both in our Zoom room and also on Facebook. And I'm here to learn. We have a wonderful group of people that have come together on very short notice, and we're going to learn about some hard stuff. We're going to learn about voter suppression. We're going to learn about some more invisible history that wasn't in our history books. We are going to hopefully also learn what some of the action steps we can take to make this world a safer and more equitable world. Of course, this weekend our theme was social and racial justice, truth, consequences, and reconciliation. So this all began, this event that came together at the last minute, because I have a tremendous amount of respect for Dr. Brenda Wade. For those of you that are regulars in the Global Peace Tribe, you've seen her on our shows several times. For anybody who doesn't know her, she is many things. She is an influencer. She is a therapist. She is a media personality. She is a writer. She's a coach. And most of all, she has a big heart. She is the love doctor. She does all those things I described, and probably a lot more, through love. And I really appreciate that about you, Brenda. So thank you very, very much.
Oh, thank you, Scott. That was very kind of you. Beautiful intro. My heart's going da-da-da-da. And back at you, because you've held this huge space throughout the pandemic for us to come together and really, as a community that's global, hold the awareness that we're not alone with the difficulties we're facing, and especially when we talk about a topic like racial and social justice. It's important that those of us who are on the front line, who are people of color, have allies who are not people of color. So the allyship that you've been cultivating, the consciousness you've been raising is extremely valuable and important. And I thank you for that. And you do it with such grace.
Oh, thank you. My pleasure. I'm going to introduce our other guests. And this is Valerie Schoon. And she made the film Invisible History, which we're going to be talking about tonight. She was an executive for Oprah Winfrey's Harpo Films. Her credits include the Golden Globe nominated Great Debaters with Denzel Washington and a wide variety of very important film projects that have helped to raise our consciousness and our awareness. Her other work included being Associate Director in News and Public Affairs at PBS. And currently, she is a professor at the College of Motion Picture Arts at Florida State University. She's especially here because of this movie that she made, a documentary called Invisible History, Middle Florida's Hidden Roots. It's been playing nationally on public TV. She won an Emmy for it. And Valerie, thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Well, thank you for having me.
I think Valerie brought in reinforcements. And what better reinforcement than you could have than your sister? This is Cecile Schoon, but Cecile is actually here as more than just Valerie's sister. Cecile has an amazing background in civil rights. She has attempted to protect the rights of those wronged at work due to race, religion, age, disability, place of birth, or unwanted sexual advances. And she serves as the president of the League of Women Voters of Florida. And this is a very powerful and important thing, as probably most of us know, but we're going to be talking about tonight, just the tragic attempt that's taking place to make it more difficult for people of color to have the right to vote. She's a proud member of the Omicron Omega chapter of Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority, and she's previously served as the chair of Florida League's efforts on restoration of rights. So thank you very, very much, Cecile, for doing this hard work. And speaking of hard work, the other person that I'm going to bring on board who has agreed to join us tonight, and I so respect what this man has done. This is Lindbergh Porter. He has represented employers in more than 50 individual and class action court, jury, and regulatory agency trials, and has handled more than 75 class actions. He represents employers in collective bargaining and other phases of traditional labor matters that come up before the National Labor Relations Board, and has handled approximately 100 arbitrations. He has worked on Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, the Fair Labor Standards Act, the National Labor Relations Act, and the Fair Employment and Housing Act. He's also authored numerous articles and speaks at law seminars, conferences all around the world. Currently, right now, although he's based in San Francisco, he's coming to us from Mississippi, which is a state where he originally hails from, but where the battle is most difficult. And anybody who spends that much time in a courtroom, I so honor that dedication to service. Thank you so much. So I'm going to bring all of our presenters on so you can see all of them. And again, thank you everybody for being activists, for the work that you are doing in the world. Thank you so very, very much. And I'm going to turn it over to you, Brenda.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Scott. And thank you very much, Val and Cecile and Lindbergh, for taking time out of what I know are crushingly busy schedules to be with us this evening to be part of this important topic. And that is really looking at how we, as the awakening world, those of us who are interested in making the world a better place, raising consciousness, being on the front line, which I think everybody who has joined us from wherever you are in the world, I saw people from Peru, across the United States coming up in the chat box. Thank you all so much for taking the time to be with us. And it shows that you are a person who's willing to learn, you're open-hearted, and you're looking at the part you can play in doing what we all have to do if we're going to awaken as a conscious world where there is equality, justice, peace for everyone. So thank you all for being here. And again, a heartfelt thanks to Scott for holding the space for all of us. What we're going to do tonight is look at just a bit of Val's film. We're going to see just a clip to start the conversation because it frames the picture. But the question we're holding is, what can we do? What do we need to do? What do we need to learn? How can we all be part of the shift? We have many, many beautiful souls that I know from the Global Peace Tribe who are meditators, healers, people who are very concerned about what's going on in the world. And our job tonight is to answer your questions, give you a sense of what is actually happening in terms of voters' rights, and also to talk about the emotional and psychological impact of living with oppression and how we can create the allyship again and help mitigate some of that impact, because it is devastating to health, mental, physical, emotional. It's crushing to relationships and families, makes it very hard to parent and raise children who aren't being dramatically affected by the impact of racism and the way that it's carried out when we can't have even the equal right to vote. So having said that, what if we look at, you guys get your questions ready. What if we look at the clip of the opening of Val's film? Scott, have you got that?
I sure do. Here we go.
Is that a good place for us to launch? Okay.
Florida was a very dynamic and diverse place. It was not this Disney World, Donald Duck society where everything was rosy. Florida had a history similar to Alabama and Georgia. You had 45% of enslaved people in Florida. And that 45% produced 90% of all the cotton in Florida by 1860. Cotton, which made Florida the most money, would not have been the product of choice had it not been for the labor of enslaved persons. They were indispensable to increasing Florida's economy. And Florida's economy would not have grown so quickly had it not been for enslaved persons.
How else are great capitals to be employed in agriculture in a new country without slaves?
You're muted, Dr. Brenda. Brenda, you're muted.
Ding. What we just looked at is just a quick encapsulation of what the history looked like. The fact that, and I didn't know this until I watched the film, that 45% of the African people who were enslaved in America went to Florida. That was all news to me. So there's a lot for us to learn about what has happened. And it may seem, oh, gee, enslavement is ancient history. It's not. It's not. It has a very long shadow. That shadow is still with us today in some very dramatic ways. And we'll be pulling back the curtain, if you will, on the ways that it's persisted. And then again, as I said earlier, looking at what we can do. So Val, would you like to tell us a little bit about what inspired you to do the film and what's important to you that you'd like us to take away?
Yes, sure. Well, as I guess you all know now that we live in Florida, but I'm not from Florida. I spent a lot of time living in LA first. And so I'm a transplant more or less. But so what inspired me to do the documentary was the fact that near where I live, there is an enslaved graveyard. And it's kind of flush with the road, so you can't really see it unless you're walking by. And so I was walking by, so I saw it and I thought, well, you know what? Here we are, an African American family living on an old plantation, it seems, so I should research it. But I came to realize, though, that all of Tallahassee and the general area was the cotton belt of Florida. And I wasn't really aware of that. And the reason I wasn't aware of that is there are no markers. There's nothing that actually says that. Aside from this graveyard that that you have to walk by, there's hardly anything else that would suggest that the entire area was plantations. And so I thought, well, let me just research it more. And then basically I started on this journey of educating myself about the history of this region. And I thought, since I'm a filmmaker, I'll make a documentary about it at the same time. And as Brenda mentioned, people do sometimes say, well, why? I don't want to talk about slavery anymore. But for me, a thing I wanted to express with this documentary was two things. One, for the 9,000, or so enslaved people who lived and died in Tallahassee, but there's hardly any mention of them. I wanted them to be remembered. And two, I wanted to speak to the idea of, why it matters is because, what was set up in slavery and those legacies, whether they're economic or emotional or psychological or Jim Crow, have an effect on the current situation. I think if we understand our history more fully, then we as a community can have conversations about how to go forward, but sort of in keeping with all of what's happened, so that we can make better decisions for our entire community. And those are sort of the reasons why I was inspired to make it.
I have a question for you. One of the things that I noticed, you had a number of quick flashes that told the story, where you saw, this incredible amount of cotton, and you saw the people working, and all of a sudden you saw this very luxurious, what I assume was like a plantation or a very luxurious place. And so, of course, the world revolves around money to a large degree, especially in less conscious places. So, to what degree did you find and it took us to 1860, his narration was to 1860. So after 1860, and after the Civil War, and after the Emancipation Proclamation, what happened? How did things change or not change?
Okay. Yeah, the documentary does go on past 1860. And basically what happens is, we have Reconstruction. And so one of the things that happens for some enslaved people, or many, is that, they're not given any money, they're not given anything. They're basically jobless, homeless, living in rags, and so for a number of people, they're sort of forced back into sharecropping, which is a sort of form of enslavement, in the sense that you are always borrowing money to work the same plantations that you worked on before. So that would be true for a lot of people. Another thing that happened was something that my sister Cecile will talk about, but following, at least in Florida in 1866, instead of the slave codes, which controlled a lot of movement, they had the black codes, which controlled a lot of the movement of the free blacks. And one of the things that they had was new laws about vagrancy. So if you're walking or you just don't have a place to go, you could be arrested and sent to prison, and then you would lose your voting rights for life. And so that was something that affected a lot of enslaved people as well, who of course had nowhere to go, and so were subject to these vagrant laws, which would lend itself to convict leasing, which would be something where you could have these people work your plantations and things like that. So so that was one aspect of Reconstruction. Although there was a positive for a short period of time, there was also for some people a positive part of Reconstruction in the fact that you could learn to read and write, and instead of it being completely illegal, it was now legal if you could find someone to sort of teach you. And that's where Black churches came in, where they would be centers of places where people could learn to read. And there were people who would get into office, political office. But a lot of that came to a sort of grinding halt with the introduction of Jim Crow, which was more or less in the sort of 1890s. And of course, that lasted until, I don't know, 1970. Maybe you lawyers can say exactly, but almost a century of Jim Crow laws.
So thank you for that history. And like, I just learned something. I had no idea that there was the racket of a vagrancy law, which then, for an extraordinarily innocent thing, a person could get thrown into prison and then could lose their voting rights and basically be enslaved as their punishment.
Right.
Just that racket. It's like,
well, that voting right issue, that the fact that people who have returning citizens, as I guess we like to say in Florida, still was on the books, for and Cecile, my sister, can speak to this. And we voted with Amendment 4. So just to say how long that legacy from slavery from 1866, and we're still waging a battle about it.
I want to appreciate what Terry Russo, one of our Zoomers, just wrote. We need to remember so we don't repeat this ever again. And we get away from marginalizing people based on being different from those in power. But it seems like we haven't fully learned this. And I think with that, I am going to bring Cecile on to talk about where we stand, what's going on with these crazy laws that are being passed.
Well, I can tell you, I've had the pleasure and honor of seeing Valerie's film, Invisible History, for numerous times, and every time it brings a lump in my throat. And just the idea of trying to get away from these ancient limiting laws, so much of it is still present in our lives. And right now in the state of Florida and many southern states, they are trying to enact other laws to make voting more difficult. But let's focus on the issue of what happens when you are all of a sudden told that you are free. Well, many of the prior owners and masters, they said, you can't fish from my pond. You can't pull that fruit from my tree. You're stealing. And they intentionally, and in the legislature is written, black and white, we can see, the intent was to felonize petty theft, was to felonize not only just walking around, but the food that you were used to you were born on this property. You didn't own anything. You were allowed in the past. So they intentionally tried to felonize the newly freed, formerly enslaved men. And they did a very good job of it. So what they were trying to do is shut the mouths immediately. They did not want to hear from this class of people or whatever subclass they perceived them to be. They were fully intent on taking that away. During that Reconstruction time, a few things did survive and did come of good fruition. So we had this push-pull situation. Immediately right afterwards, many of the black legislators who were voted in, and we had a couple of senators and others, they thought, well, the ability to educate yourself and read is the way out, along with voting. So that was one of the first things they did, was build public schools. The concept of public schools came mostly from formerly enslaved people, to take tax dollars to help everybody, to lift up the whole community. And so the struggle that we have today, if you fast forward in that, is after the Jim Crow laws and the idea of felonizing every little move, they said, once you become a felon, you lose your right to vote. So that was intentional. And that stayed on the books for over 150 years. And in the state of Florida, what we tried to do is the citizens and some of the black legislators, they would bring a proposed bill, but it would never get out of committee, right? It would just sit there and die on the vine. So we have something in Florida called a citizens initiative, and in California, it's called a proposition, where the citizens can get together and band together and get for it. And that can become law. And we did that with Amendment 4. And so that was our effort to restore the voting rights of persons with felony convictions who had completed their sentence. And lo and behold, right, you try to get this wonderful event. What does the state of legislators do? This was in 2019. The initiative passed in 2018. Well, they enacted some legislation to tighten the pipeline. And they said, not only do you have to finish your incarceration, not only do you have to finish your probation, not only do you have to do all these other things, now you must pay all your fines and fees. And that was not what the people had wanted. But they put this additional limitation on a group of people who have a felony conviction, which impacts their ability to earn income, pay their bills, take care of themselves, let alone pay a fine. So instead of 1.4 million people being enfranchised, less than 50,000 have been able to get their voting rights back as a result of that law, because so many people still own fines and fees and they're unable to pay. So that is one of the things that there's this big push from the citizens to get it done, and they pushed us back. And if you want to jump ahead and talk about the public schools, what's going on now in the state of Florida and many other states is they don't want to teach about our African American history or slavery or what would happen to the Native American peoples, because they don't want to upset people's children, is the rationale that they're using. But it's literally censorship. So here we started, right? Valerie's film starts talking about, she spoke about what the Black legislators did initially once slavery ended. They knew they had to educate the people. And right now we have on the books, it's being passed despite all sorts of people complaining and saying that censorship. They are again trying to stop the education of the history of talking about these difficult subjects. And as people were saying earlier, if you don't study it and talk about it, you're often going to repeat it. In addition, they're piling on more and more requirements and limitations for voting, which we refer to as voter suppression. So it's very scary, actually, when you look at what was going on immediately after Reconstruction and the Jim Crow laws and the different techniques that are being used right now across the nation in many of the states to take away and make it more difficult to vote. And I'll end with, guess what? Our governor wants. Our governor, who stated immediately after our 2020 elections, they were the best elections in the nation. Everybody should follow Florida. Everybody was so proud, regardless of who you wanted to win. The process had gone so smoothly, and we'd gotten our results back. We didn't have hanging chads. Yay, we were progressing. Well, that's changed now in this political environment, because now the governor and the legislators want to have voting police. They are literally enacting laws to put law enforcement police officers to look around for the non-existent voting fraud. And in my mind, we are definitely going backwards to many of the tools that were used to threaten and scare African Americans from voting in the South. So that's where we are right now. We are literally trying to battle that. And that is a clear return to threatening behavior under a governor who has indicated he's very interested in limiting the voting rights of certain groups more than others.
A governor, I might add, who, if Donald Trump is not the next Republican nominee, my understanding is your governor is the probable person who will be the Republican nominee. I want to call upon Lindbergh. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us. And I'd love to hear, you have an extraordinary perspective, 40 years of being in the courtrooms and dealing with these cases. What is your take on where we stand as a nation in regards to these issues?
Thank you, Scott. I want to emphasize what Cecile talked about and have us really recognize the period that we are in. What she described is what happened immediately following Reconstruction, which lasted just 10 years. And all of the efforts to disenfranchise, to undermine folk who had just recently become enfranchised, are the kinds of things that we are seeing now in restrictions on voting, interference, harassment. And those are exactly the kinds of things that happened immediately after. And it's ironic that we had the black codes and the unlawfulness of being unlawful to teach folk to read, and to even in Mississippi, which is where I am now and where I grew up, to distribute, for example, Jet magazine, Ebony, when I was growing up some 50 plus years ago. And we now have the same thing, banning books. Can't talk about or teach about race or gender or climate change. And those are things that we need to recognize being repeated, so that these things are not new, and we need to figure out how to spend our time not only swimming against the tide as we have to survive, but really how we can kind of redirect the current in which we swim. Because if we spend all of our time fighting against what is being thrown at us, it means that we're using political and social economic capital, and we're not getting anywhere. We are simply losing ground because we're fighting against things that have distracted us and have held us back. And that's exactly what I'm seeing here where I am, which is the same thing that's happening across the South, as Cecile just reminded us of, and the importance for us of keeping the focus on where we are trying to go and where we need to go as we fight against the opposition.
Dr. Brenda, I want to just bring you on and ask you what comes up for you and where would you like to take this conversation?
Well, as I'm listening to Cecile, to Lenberg, listening to the history that was outlined by Valerie and our other presenters, it does seem as if there's been a rubber band that was stretched, and it looked as if the rubber band would be large enough to cover all the laws and to hold freedom in place, and equality would emerge. It's clear that all of that has snapped back to the historic lows that we had in the past. And the question that comes up for me first is, I'm feeling it. I feel the pain of it. I was looking at the chat. Several people spoke to the difficulty. And guys, bear with me, because my battery on my computer just gave me the signal it's about to go out. Somebody else talk while I plug in.
Well, I actually have a question that I wanted to ask you, Valerie. So I'm going to put the spotlight on you. As a filmmaker, tell us about your journey. Where were you when you began this project? What inspired you to do it? And then after all the research, all the interviews, all the footage you gathered, what did you learn, and how did your consciousness or maybe your beliefs change?
Okay. Well, I think that, I guess I can sort of speak. I think this invisible history, I mean, my history in film, and whether I was working in Hollywood or working for Oprah or here, has certainly been centered on African-American history or African-American literature. Being exposed to, so the different things I've worked on, whether it's, the Great Debaters, where they're in Jim Crow South and, encounter the trauma of lynching, or Beloved, Toni Morrison's Beloved, which is, agonizing look at slavery. I think that's always sort of permeates my thinking, and I'm just very much interested in American history. And I certainly obviously think that African-American history has been sort of overlooked. So I try to focus on that. So in terms of this one, it sort of fits within, it fits within the general scheme of things for my work. But I think with this particular project, despite having said all of that and thinking that I've been exposed to it, I nevertheless learned some new things in this one, and it did become more visceral and real for me. Perhaps because I live in the South now, and when I worked on those other projects, I lived in LA. You know what I mean? So, so it had a more it hit me in a different way, because I realized that this is where we're raising our family. And there are things I didn't understand, like the the forced migration of enslaved people from Upper South, from Virginia and North Carolina. That's what actually populated the Lower South, which is like Louisiana and Florida and Alabama. So that was a huge forced migration, which broke up a lot of families and was very painful to see. And that's something I wasn't aware of. And I think the other thing that I became aware of is that the people who are from this region know the history. They just don't necessarily talk about it. This would be Black people or white people, but all the transplants don't know about it. Do you know what I mean? And so I felt that, so it depends who I would speak to. So I realized that I really had a shallow knowledge. And I think that my takeaway is that, no matter what community you live in, it's good to sort of understand the history beyond the last 20 years, like the deeper history, of what happened. So, Cecile mentioned whether it's the Native American history, I think, and even though this documentary, let me say, starts in 1830, because I was focused on 1820, whatever, I was focused on the period of enslavement in Tallahassee, but of course it has a much longer history than that, which I'd like to also explore, about the Seminole Wars and what happened with Native Americans and all of that. So I feel like that would be my takeaway, that there's so much history to look at for whatever county or city you live in, but that it's so important to understand it, to understand the context for now. And I think the voting issue from 1866 to now gives you some context. This isn't just like last week, this is a lot of people, many people who've been deprived of their right to vote, which is a very American concept. So.
Scott, yeah, I'm looking at some of the notes coming into the chat of people adding to the conversation about what's going on right now. And for me, coming, from my wheelhouse as a psychologist, what's important to me is that we actually allow ourselves to feel this. One of the reasons these laws can persist is that people who are people of goodwill, who understand that we're part of a human family, who understand that there's no us against them, it's only all of us, and either everyone rises or everyone is actually on an energetic and spiritual level being degraded. And it's so important for us to embrace our common humanity. I was speaking with you earlier, I think maybe it was last night, Scott, when we were talking, that the word hue means light, the word mon means being. We're all light beings. We're all part of a human family. And the tendency to use the color of someone's skin, whether we're all human or not, immediately the fact that we are human gets degraded. The person is degraded. And it's a painful thing. So I'm just for a moment going to ask our allies, and of course, our friends who are also on this journey with us, to just feel the pain of it for a moment, because the pain allows us to open our hearts a little wider, to think more deeply about being part of the solution. If it's an intellectual exercise only, I think we miss some of the gravitas, some of the importance, some of the depth of the call that you're actually hearing right now as you're hearing Lindbergh and hearing Cecile and Valerie speak. This is a call to action, because it's going to take people of goodwill joining in the action to make legislators and people who are manipulating the system. And again, nobody needs me to say the obvious, it's for material gain.
Yeah.
It's for material gain.
Thank you for that, Brenda. And I do want to read some of the comments coming in. Serafina writes just now, totally on point to hear and feel the pain. It grows empathy and compassion and action. And I don't know how to pronounce it. Kirain writes, yes, We are all in this space together, and we need to tap on our common humanity, although these are challenging and dark times. And Wanda writes that the voter suppression laws passed in Texas, Georgia, and any other state that you want to know about, and that's all taking place in current legislative sessions. And thank you. In the chat box, I see people are kind of sharing. Josiane talks about a book called An American Brand of Apartheid, and from slavery to present. So thank you everybody for, kind of coming in and sharing with us. Last thing, again, Karine, I don't know how to pronounce your name, I'm so sorry. Well said. We need the energy to resist this tide, turning us back and moving us forward in justice, grace, love, and unity.
Beautifully expressed. So I was curious also to ask, particularly Cecile and Lindbergh, what recommendations do you have that could engage more of us in the legal battles? Is there anything that we can do to support the work that you're doing? Or what should we be doing in our own corner of the world? We've covered the whole country here.
I think that I'm going to put a link in the chat. There was a question of where can I go? I've got to get the site properly, and I'll type it up and stick it in there. But it's called Voting Rights Lab, and they are doing a legislative tracker across the state on voter suppression laws. That's pretty up to date. That many of the people at the forefront are double checking if you want to know what's going on across the different states, and you'll find there's been a lot of similarity. So I think because it's coming from very conservative think tanks who give out this list, do this. And so you have oftentimes a very conservative or Republican leaning.
Your sound went out. Sound.
Can you hear me now?
Now, yes. Thank you.
Okay, I'm not sure what happened. I haven't touched anything. I'll just move it a little closer to make sure the mic picks me up. I was saying there has been a concerted effort across the nation. It's coming from very limited sources, and so some of the looks very, very similar. It's not just voting rights that are being attacked. It's education. It's a woman's right to choose, as you see in Texas, Mississippi, and Florida, taking away a woman's right to very intimate decisions are health decisions that should be made with her and her family and her doctor. Is now the state is getting involved. So there's just been an onslaught on that we all need to be aware of. There are groups that have historically fought against these things and are continuing to. The one group that I'm a member of, the League of Women Voters, we have these organizations in pretty much in every state. We are nonpartisan, but we are champions of as many people to vote as possible around the nation, and have been involved in litigation with regards to that, and redistricting, which we can talk about a little bit more. There's the ACLU that many groups are aware of. There's the Southern Poverty Law Center, New York. There are organizations that have historically and have presently been working on these issues around the nation. And if you were to Google any of these, you would see they would give you information on some of the litigation that they've been involved with. So even though everybody is not a lawyer, they could take a moment and find an organization that they feel comfortable with, their mantra, their mission, and if they feel comfortable, contribute and put a note to litigating for whatever you think is important.
Oh, and also I should just add that Cecile's not just a member, she is the first Black president of the Florida League of Women Voters. So she was a member, but she for years, and now is leading the charge in Florida. And I'm a member also of the League of Women Voters. So I truly do think, and it's open to men too, men and or other gender, can join. It's not just women. So I think it's a great organization if you're able to join in your state or county.
And I
Nice,
want to add
sister
one
move, Val. Thank you.
Thank you, Val. I want to add one comment about the league. The league actually got its start with, they were essentially, the initial core were Quaker women, very religious, and they were part of the Underground Railroad. And they would have these formerly enslaved people with lashes on their back, open wounds, stories of children being wrenched from their hands, the mothers. I mean, it was awful. And they were so incensed that of the treatment of another human being to another, and that this white hierarchy, patriarchy, tried to say that they were better than God. They would be acting like God. That incensed them. They wanted to speak about it. And many of their husbands said, no, 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 go back into the kitchen. So these women, when they saw trying to help another group of people, they had no power without the vote. They had nothing but to rely on the good whims of their husbands to get anything done. And that opened up their minds to, we need to get the vote so we can be empowered to impact the issues we care about. And that is really the fun foundational start of the League, and why we are so concerned about the voting rights of everyone, in particular those who've been marginalized, because that is our history.
Wow, I didn't know that history. That's fascinating, Cecile. Goodness, to know that it came from Quaker women, that resonates for me, because again, it's bringing the spiritual, that we're all interconnected. And I think from that spiritual place, that inspiration, that higher awareness, that's a place we can draw strength from. It's a place where the playing field becomes very level, because we can see that humanity and that spirituality in every being. And I honestly believe that was the secret to the success of the civil rights movement with Dr. King and his mentor, Dr. Howard Thurman, that they brought the spiritual essence of who we are as beings to the forefront. And it awakened something. It awakened something very simple. And I think it's compassion. You know, we talk about the 12 powers of the heart: love, wisdom, truth, compassion, poise, balance, self-control, forgiveness. But compassion is probably the most important one.
There's a really, I think, powerful question that's come up in the chat box. It was sent to me as a private message, so I won't say the person's name. But this person writes, I struggle with fighting and resisting existing systems. I was hoping to hear what we might do to create new equality for all, but perhaps I'm being too idealistic. I sometimes feel as though I'm stuck straddling two dimensions, fifth dimension and third dimension. And I really appreciate that. I'm going to bring everybody on because, there is that part of us that wants to believe that love and compassion will be enough. And then there's others that are like, no, we have to fight. And it's a worthy question. It's a dilemma. It is a dilemma. Most of us are peaceful people. We don't want to have to fight. We don't want to have to we don't want to add gasoline to the fire. But on the other hand, we don't want to spiritually bypass these things. So I'm really curious what each of you have to say in reference to that very vulnerable thought and question.
Who'd like to go first? I'm going to pick on Valerie.
You're going to pick on me to go first? Well, actually, if I'm not, if you could just reiterate the question, because I think I want to make sure I understand it before I answer it.
Go ahead, Scott.
All right. My understanding of the question is finding that balance of, or where I guess I'm taking her comment and making a question out of it, is what is your perception of the balance between fighting against existing systems versus longing for a compassionate, love everybody, love will win out in the end approach, right? Okay. Most of us are peaceful people. We don't want to fight. To what degree do we need to fight? Or how do we fight and maintain a sense of peace within ourselves?
Well, that's a good question. I don't think I have the answer to that one, really. I mean, I think maybe it depends where you live. You know what I mean? But I feel like in Florida, it feels like a fight. You know what I mean? And because as Cecile was saying, everywhere you look, there's like, what? There's, something else is happening, that requires, getting out there and speaking up and doing something. So it feels more like a fight. I think in terms of compassion and love, I would say that portion of it really comes in more for, that's the hard part to sort of keep in there, actually. You know what I mean? To be honest, it's hard to keep it in there too much. It's mostly, it's not so much that I'm motivated by hate as much as I'm motivated by trying to save what I think is important, so to sort of keep education, to be able to, have, to have full freedom, you know what I mean? To have people have the right to vote, to be able to talk about, Black history. So I feel like it's a fight to sort of save those freedoms. And I do struggle with the idea of love solving the problem. Although I like the idea of it, when it's boots on the ground down here, it feels more like a fight, to be honest.
Yeah.
Well, I think if you look back to, we had mentioned, I believe Dr. King's name has been mentioned this evening. If not, it should be mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
But he was fighting.
He was
Peace
fighting.
and love. He was fighting with peace and love. But every time he went out, he knew he could be jailed, beaten, killed, shot. I mean, he did not sit back. He took his love and compassion out there, and he wore it on his sleeve. But he still fought back in a very direct and very courageous and brave way. And whatever issues I have personally, and there have been times in my little southern town, I've sued the city, or I've sued someone. I sued the one town, and there was white firefighters who had said if they came across a Black person, this is in my lifetime, this is like 10 years ago, if they came across a Black person, they would not provide mouth-to-mouth resuscitation because they just didn't want to get that close to a Black person. And that person was just going to have to die.
Whoa.
Well, that got reported. Another white firefighter reported that, came to me, and he was targeted. He had the N lover written on his car, and he was threatened. I took his case, the white man's case, who reported it. And there was a big investigation, and many of them were fired. Well, they were gun-toting, angry, said they were going to do this, that, and the other. And we had police protection for a minute. And that just gave me a little tiny sense of what Dr. King and his people dealt with every day. And I thought to myself, could I even come close to that kind of commitment, knowing every time you walked out the door, you may not see your children again? That just blows my mind. So when people talk about, I want to be peaceful, or do I stand up for something? I'm like, there were peaceful people who stood up for things, and it was hard. And that's just something we have to deal with. That's part of our human condition. Yes, you can meditate and you can be peaceful, to pick ways to stand up for those who cannot or need help protecting.
Well, in that sense, I'll agree with you, Cecile, on that one, because it does take a lot. And when you look at, I was recently working on another project, so I was looking at some video on Martin Luther King Jr. speeches, and it is very much, a battle, but, they would pray first, and they would, and so in that sense, God's love did help them. You could see that, and you do need to, the work is hard. And I think, as somebody said in the chat, it's just, you're going about it in a pacifist way, but it's a battle.
Yeah. And Lindbergh, what are your thoughts?
I think ultimately love is the answer, but we are not there yet.
Mm-hmm.
James Baldwin, in the late 70s, speaking at the University of California, said, "Every white person in this country I do not care what he says or what she says, knows one thing. They know that they would not like to be Black here. If they know that, they know everything they need to know. And whatever else they say is a lie. We have been here before. And until we get to a point where white people would not mind being Black people in this country, we will not have arrived at this place, this feeling, this moment of love. And until white people get to the point, there is fighting to be done. The people on this call, Black folk on this call, have learned to swim against this current that we have faced and Black folk in this country for 400 years. And some people look at the people on this call and say, well, all the others have as well. And that's simply not true. We have simply learned to swim against the current. And the current needs to be changed. And that's one of the things that white people can help do, to change the current as we try to swim against it to survive. And until, the phrase Black Lives Matter, and until we can say Black Lives Matter and mean it, we cannot say all lives matter. And the failure to come to grips with that, because we have made some progress, because we are not sharecroppers, as Cecile has talked about, and because we are not thrown into penal colonies and having to work on plantations. Yes, that's progress, but we are not where people would like to think that we are. Malcolm X talked about the knife in the back, and if somebody sticks a knife in your back and pulls it out halfway, are you to say we have made progress? When they pull it out all the way, is that enough? His answer was no. You have to remedy the harm that was done as a result of that infliction to begin with. And this is difficult. It's hard for us. It's hard for America. But until we do that, we'll be having this conversation. My children will be having this conversation.
That was just so beautifully, eloquently put, Lindbergh. Thank you. That really hit home for me. Thank you. And I see Serafina writes, well said, Lindbergh. Thank you. Swimmers get tired, and as a white person, I can help change the current and swim too, not only hold the space, but honoring the pain of the experience. Thank you, Serafina.
Yeah, I want to add to that. I loved what you had to say, Lindbergh, and to illuminate, that leading with love doesn't mean we're not taking powerful action. King led with love. Gandhi led with love. Gandhi sent his only possession, his shoes, to his enemy, Lord Mountbatten, and said, I'm sending you this gift to honor you, but you are not my friend. You're my enemy, but yet you're another human. And he fought on with, in South Africa, we saw the same thing. We have the intention to do what must be done, and the intention to do it in a nonviolent way. But it means allyship. It means having that sense of our hearts being connected to that North Star that King talked about, Spirit, God. And that all of that together, bringing our spiritual essence together, our humanity together, our intelligence together, with the will, the very strong will that Lindbergh alluded to, the will to be different and do it differently. So all of our allies, Scott, I know you're an ally. There are many allies who are part of this community, to do everything in your power, whether it's sending money, whether it's joining a march, whether it's circulating petitions and making sure that those legislators who are having a free-for-all in the South also hear from you. You know, they're absolutely joyfully and gleefully. Valerie's son was outlining for me. He just spent a week in the legislature as a page. Is that what he was doing, Val?
Yes, he was a page.
And outlining just his absolute shock that these legislators were just intentionally stripping away all the rights of African Americans in Florida, the right to vote, returning citizens, on and on and on, redistricting. And I was wondering, Cecile, if you could take a minute and talk about redistricting, because that's one of the ways that votes of people of color are being undermined. I'm not sure everybody understands how widespread it is and what it is.
Absolutely. Redistricting is when we, in different states, there are different entities that draw lines to show people who they can vote for, and it shows politicians and candidates what group of people they should target their pitches to get them to vote. And that's called redistricting. And there's two things that we should remember about it. There are major lines that are drawn in each state every 10 years after the census. After the census, there's an apportionment of, there's only so many Congress people that we can have. I believe it's 400. And then they're apportioned by how different states grow in size or lessen in size. So Florida got another congressperson slot, and another state lost that. So you have this apportionment issue. And then it goes into, how do you draw the lines to determine who's going to vote for who? What's going on in the state of Florida is our governor is getting involved in that and has recommended redistricting maps that would take away 2 congressional districts, which had been, as a remedy for past discrimination, had been considered African American opportunity districts. And so he is saying, take those away, which seems to be a violation of the Voting Rights Act. So this is what's being challenged right now, is there is a law, Act of 1965, which says that if there are opportunities for minorities by race or by language, if there are opportunities to draw a district in a way where they can have an opportunity to select a representative of their choosing, then that needs to be done if certain circumstances are met. And going on is there is an attack on the Voting Rights Act to try to dismantle that remedy after, again, hundreds of years of not being able to vote and voter physical threats, as Dr. King and his generation faced for voting. Finally, in 1965, they were saying, stop the lynching, protect us. And this was one of the laws that came about. And right now, this very powerful law is being defamed. It started in 2013 with the Shelby case, United States Supreme Court case. And in that case, they said, the Supreme Court said, basically that the certain southern states and certain towns in the South no longer had to have pre-clearance before the voting rights. They could make new voting laws to impact voting rights. And so the dismantling of the Voting Rights Act, which started in 2013, is being presently challenged and threatened even today. So some of the protections that Dr. King fought for and many people died for are now under direct attack. And that is something that people should be aware of. And those are, what can you do? Write your representative, write your congressman, talk to your neighbors, because I don't know that the average citizen understands that many of the things that Dr. King fought for is now under direct attack and is being harmed.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you, Cecile. Well, I know that we want to help. So one of the things that I've heard, I want to kind of conclude with what are practical action steps. And one thing that I heard is everybody should join the League of Women Voters, the League. We should
Or
support.
something.
Yes, or something. Well, you had mentioned, of course, the League of Women Voters, but you also mentioned a couple of others. So say those slowly so people can write them down. What are other fairly prominent organizations in most states, or even ones that are international? Because we do have friends on Unified coming from Canada, Spain, Portugal. Um, what are some of the organizations that we can either financially support or join?
The Southern Poverty Law Center, and I'll put it in the chat. I'm not good at talking and writing at the same time, but I will in just a second.
I'll go find it while you do that.
They're a one.
We
And
lost
they're
part of what you
Mon-
said. Cecile, repeat that, please.
Southern Poverty Law Center. They're located in Montgomery, and they are amazing. They are the group that sued the Klan and helped to draw a lot of their resources out of the Klan to make the Klan much less powerful today than it was. A great organization, the Southern Poverty Law Center. There it is.
There it is.
Yes. Yes.
And the actual website, I mean, you can put in Southern Poverty Law Center, or it's splcenter.org. splcenter.org. And right up top is how we can donate. And talking about Florida, look at their headline: Unlawful Hold, Legal U.S. Resident Jailed as Florida Sheriff Sought an ICE Detainer. Just hours after being arrested on a misdemeanor charge that was later dropped, he posted a $100 bond, thought he would be released. Under the law, he should have been set free, and said the Marion County Sheriff's Office moved him from a holding area and decided to keep him in an overcrowded housing area for second night, while repeatedly asking Immigration and Customs Enforcement, also known as ICE, whether they wanted to take him into custody. Why? Because of his nationality. So there it is. I mean, it's happening in Florida, and it is important for us to support legal organizations like this. So thank you for bringing that one up.
And in the chat, I saw someone suggest ACLU.
Yes.
Also,
I
the American
mentioned
Civil
them
Liberties
also.
Union. Mhm.
They're very strong. They were a main partner with us in Florida getting Amendment 4 passed. That was the citizens initiative that restored the voting rights of persons who had felonies who completed their sentences. The ACLU was instrumental in that litigation with us, with the league. We litigated together. The Brennan Center, they're in New York. They're part of NYU University. They are phenomenal. Voting rights protectors around the nation. And they also go out and have litigated with us in Florida and many states, and have the whole cadre of voting rights experts, redistricting experts, women's rights experts. They're about the rights of individuals, and the best of our nation. They're good. And the NAACP, an old and favorite. I myself am a life member, and there are a lot of branches in different localities. And I always say, when you join an organization that's something like that, that's very historical, it's really important, if you are a newbie, is to just get in there and see what they're doing, and don't necessarily try to, bring them up to speed if they don't have computers or everything. Just work with the people that are there and get involved with what they're doing. And then slowly your talents and your knowledge can be worked into the organization. But sometimes you have to be careful. And I fall prey to this issue too. We're so excited. We really want to help. And when you get in there and you want to tell everybody how to do everything, and you want to boss them around, and
That's because you're an eldest sister, Cecile.
well, I think a lot of us are fall prey to that mistake, when you're joining an organization that maybe you have not been around a lot, if you see that there are deficits or things that you'd like to do, and I forgot to show everybody my shirt. There it is. Vote. It's my
Thank you.
it's
Thank
my
you for wearing
sorority
that.
shirt. My sorority shirt for voting. But when you get in there and you get overexcited, it can cause unintentional misunderstandings.
Yeah.
So I would say that those. Any others that you can think of, Val?
Well, I was going to ask, I think I was going to throw it over to Lindbergh because I think he's working, I'm not even sure which group he's working with. So maybe he wants to talk about that.
Yes, I certainly would have included and would include the League of Women Voters, not only for membership, but for seminars and speakers, and to educate ourselves regarding the issues that are prevalent or priority issues in our respective states. A little bit different in Mississippi than in Florida than in California, for example. And those are seminars and speakers and people who are very well informed that occur weekly. And we can start by educating ourselves on an individual level and joining and becoming active as the case might be. But part of what we suffer from is the absence of knowledge and misinformation, false information, and that's part of what those who are opposed to justice and freedom and equality in this country are doing now to undereducate and misinform and deny education to their own children, which is ironic as the time that we're in. So there's some individual things that we can do. We can not tolerate our neighbors and friends, family members too, in the kinds of acts and racist, sexist, misogynistic comments that they make at the dinner table, or correct them, move them in the right direction. We can educate ourselves, as I mentioned. We can listen to women and migrants and Black folk and people of color and others when they tell their stories of the experiences that they are having, without trying to suggest that that's anomalous or that there's another explanation for the way you would treat it, that not based on the color of your skin or your gender or your origin, but listen to get a better understanding. I do think, I mentioned Baldwin once, reading Baldwin again can be very helpful to us because what he had to say still is relevant today. And had Baldwin's insights were well ahead of their time, consistent with the time and for our time as well. So I really think the League of Women Voters, the other organization that we mentioned, in terms of just educating ourselves, can be a great start and to beginning to take action. But there are things that we can do individually. And just because we cannot change everything or change everybody does not mean that we shouldn't try to change one person, or we shouldn't try to save one person or help one person, if that's what we can do at the moment as we expand. And those were the kinds of things that led us to the progress that we have made. And the part of what will be essential. Sometimes we get discouraged because we can't change everything overnight. Americans are not very patient. And that's both a value and a benefit, and has helped the country on the one hand. It's held us back on another because we just don't take a long-term view and long-term commitment to things. This is a long-distance race for those of us who are in it. And there are times when we can sprint, but it is a long-distance race, and it is a relay race. And those who are involved can hand off to others when we get tired, but get back in the race because it'll outlast all of us.
Thank you. Beautifully said.
Yeah.
And I'd like to add one last thing, Scott. This is piggybacking on what Lindbergh just said about fatigue. there is a lot of energy that's expended, and it can be difficult work. And at the very least, if we could do two things, one is do everything we can to resource ourselves from the inside out. And the other is following on what Lindbergh and Cecile said, support one another. Doing this work can be sometimes heartbreaking, exhausting, and it's challenging. It's always challenging. And this is where I think King and Gandhi and Nelson Mandela drew their strength. They reach very deeply into the well of their spiritual understanding and bringing that spirituality forward, whatever that means for you. But to tap into that light, that universal love, seeing all of us connected as a human family, it was that strength of people marching, singing, praying in India, in South Africa, in America, that brought about the changes that we did see that were monumental in the area of human rights. And to reclaim the ground we've lost and to gain new ground, we need that sense of interconnectedness, that strength in numbers, and that strength in heartfelt conviction.
Beautifully stated. Beautifully, beautifully stated. Thank you. I'm deeply touched, and I'm going to bring everybody back on screen so we can just kind of thank them for their time. And this is kind of the completion of what's been a powerful weekend. I'm going to put into the chat box, both for Zoom and also I'll take it over to Facebook. If you have missed some of the other episodes of our Friday night, Saturday night, this morning, and now this, all of these programs will be on our YouTube channel tomorrow morning, as well as everything else that we've done on the Awakening World, and prior to that, my Saturday Night Live and Straight Talk shows. And I want to thank all of you for just years and years and years of hard work. And like Lindbergh said, this is a marathon, not a sprint. And we live in a culture, especially I'm a California guy, and let's face it, Californians are not famous for patience. We're not famous for being in the long haul. We're kind of, I want it all and I want it all now. And there's a lot of that thinking in my tribe and in my culture. And so I do appreciate years and years of dedication and fighting legal battles and fighting uphill and swimming upstream, as you put it. And like one of our viewers said, I also recognize that swimmers swimming upstream must get very tired. So God bless you, and I will do what I can to continue to promote these programs, get your information out there. I'd love to have all of you on future episodes of The Awakening World or any other programs that end up evolving out of this. I really appreciate you, Brenda, for initiating this and giving our tribe, our Global Peace Tribe, an opportunity to meet these three beautiful souls. And
these are people very close to my heart. So I'm thrilled that you guys took the time to join. Thank you so much, Val and Cecile and Lindbergh. And thank you again, Scott, for holding the space.
My pleasure.
And being a woke soul. We appreciate you.
And thank you, everybody, for watching. Thank you for our regulars and the new people who came in on Unify, Facebook, and anybody watching this recording. Thank you. Share it with others. You can take the Facebook recording or the YouTube recording tomorrow. Share it with your friends. Send it out to people so we can all become educated. I learned several things tonight, so I want to thank you all for that. God's blessings for those of you, especially on the East Coast. Get a good night's rest. Thank you, Valerie, for jumping on right after a long drive. And take care, everybody, and look forward to our next connection.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.